The wind had teeth, and it was chewing on Hattie's bones. It tore through the thin wool of her coat, a garment worn past respectable, and well into the territory of a shroud. It was the same wind that had taken her will, a fever that started with a chill on the trail and ended with a shallow grave dug in frozen earth 3 weeks ago. Now it seemed determined to take what was left, her and the 3 children huddled against her legs. Ben, at 8, tried to be a man, his face set hard against the cold, but a tremor ran through his small body that he couldn't control. 6-year-old Sarah had her face buried in Hattie's skirt, her sobs muffled by the fabric. And little Leo, only 4, was a dead weight in her arms, his breath a weak, rattling thing that terrified her more than the wind. They stood at the edge of a town that called itself Redemption. It didn't look redeeming. It looked like a collection of wooden boxes dropped in the mud and forgotten by God. The setting sun bled across the horizon, painting the snow-dusted prairie in hues of bruised purple and angry orange. There was one street, a river of muck and ice, flanked by a general store, a saloon whose cheerful light felt like a personal insult, and a dozen other low-slung buildings. A notice, tacked to a post outside the store, flapped in the wind. It was the only reason they had walked the last 2 miles instead of simply lying down to die. Ben, his voice chapped, read the words Hattie could barely make out through the tears freezing on her lashes. House. Keeper wanted. Inquire at the Thatcher Place. North edge of town. The Thatcher Place. Even the name sounded cold. Asking for directions earned them a suspicious stare from a man wrapped in a buffalo coat. He pointed a mittened hand toward a dark shape that broke the flat line of the horizon, a house standing alone, away from the meager comfort of the town. It looked like a fortress, or a tomb. It looked like the last place on earth a half-frozen widow with 3 children should go, which was exactly why Hattie turned toward it. Desperation didn't leave room for pride or for fear. It left only the next step, and the one after that. The walk was an eternity. Each step was a negotiation with the ice and her own failing strength. Leo's weight seemed to double, then triple. Sarah stumbled and fell, her cry a thin, sharp sound swallowed by the wind. Hattie hauled her up, her own movements clumsy and slow, her hands too numb to properly feel her daughter's arm. By the time they reached the porch of the Thatcher Place, the last of the light had died. The house was a 2-story silhouette against a sky full of cold, indifferent stars. No lights shone in the windows. It was as silent and forbidding as a cliff face. "Maybe he ain't home, Ma," Ben whispered, his teeth chattering a frantic rhythm. "He's home," Hattie said, though she had no way of knowing. She just couldn't allow for any other possibility. She shifted Leo to one hip, marched up the 3 wooden steps that groaned under her weight, and knocked. The sound was small, swallowed by the sheer size of the door and the vastness of the night. She waited. Nothing. The wind howled, mocking her. She gathered what was left of her strength and knocked again, harder this time, the heel of her hand striking the wood with a series of dull, desperate thuds. A sound from within. The scrape of a chair, a heavy footstep. A bolt slid back with a noise like stone grinding on stone. The door opened a crack, spilling a sliver of yellow lamplight onto the porch. A man's face appeared in the gap. He was not what she expected, though she didn't know what she had been expecting. He was tall, broad in the shoulder, with a face that looked like it had been carved from granite and left out in the weather. Dark hair, a thick beard that didn't hide the hard set of his jaw, and eyes that were the color of a winter sky. He looked from her face, to the child in her arms, to the 2 shivering beside her. His expression didn't change. It was a wall. "The notice," Hattie said, her voice a raw croak, "for the housekeeper." The man, Thatcher, just stared. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind and the sound of Sarah's whimpering. He wasn't just a man, he was a presence, a force of stillness and something else. Something dangerous that coiled beneath the surface. He was a gunslinger. She saw it in the way he stood, balanced on the balls of his feet, his hand resting nowhere near the pistol on his hip, but aware of it all the same. His gaze was heavy, assessing. It was the gaze of a man who was used to measuring threats. Notice didn't say anything about children, he said. His voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. It wasn't unkind. It wasn't anything. It was a statement of fact. He was going to close the door. She could see it in the slight shift of his weight. The wall was about to become solid again. In that moment, a lifetime of hardship welled up in Hattie. She had buried a husband, walked 1,000 miles, and starved for days. She would not be defeated by a closed door. But before she could speak, to plead or argue, Leo let out a deep, hacking cough from the depths of his little chest. It was a wet, ugly sound, the sound of sickness taking root. Something flickered in the man's winter sky eyes, a brief, almost imperceptible change. He looked at the boy, then back at Hattie's face, pale and desperate in the gloom. He didn't say a word. He simply pulled the door wider. "Get in," he said, his voice still rough, still devoid of warmth, "before you freeze to the porch." The relief was so sudden, so total, that Hattie nearly collapsed. She stumbled over the threshold, Ben and Sarah scrambling in behind her. The warmth inside was not a comfort. It was a shock, a painful assault on their frozen skin. The door closed, cutting off the wind with a final heavy thud. The entryway was vast and dark, smelling of dust, old smoke, and a profound, echoing loneliness. Thatcher led them past a shadowy staircase and into a large room dominated by a stone fireplace where a low fire guttered. "Sit," he commanded, gesturing to the hearth. Hattie sank to the floor, pulling her children close. She unwrapped Leo from her coat, his small face flushed with fever. Thatcher disappeared and returned a moment later with a thick wool blanket, which he dropped beside her without a word. It was old and smelled of horse and leather, but it was the most beautiful thing Hattie had ever seen. He then went to the kitchen, the sound of his boots loud on the wooden floors. He came back with a loaf of dark bread, a wedge of cheese, and a tin of water. He set them on the floor. "Eat," he said. It was another command, not an invitation. He retreated to a chair in the far corner of the room, a sentinel in the shadows, and began cleaning a rifle, the metallic clicks echoing in the cavernous space. He didn't watch them, but Hattie felt his awareness like a physical weight. Her children ate like starving animals, tearing at the bread with numb fingers. Hattie forced herself to eat slowly, to make it last, her eyes fixed on the flames. She was in the house of a stranger, a hard, silent man who was almost certainly dangerous, but for the first time in weeks, she was warm, and for tonight, that was enough. When Hattie awoke, it was to a pale, gray light filtering through a grime-covered window. The fire had been banked, a low heat still radiating from the embers. Thatcher was gone. The heavy blanket was tucked around her and the children, who were still sleeping in a tangled pile on the floor. For a moment she panicked, thinking he had simply left them, abandoned them in his empty house. But the front door was still bolted from the inside. His rifle was gone from its rack by the door, as was his heavy coat. He was out, not gone for good. She sat up, her body aching with a deep, bone-weary soreness. The room, in the daylight, was even more stark and neglected than it had seemed at night. A thick layer of dust coated every surface. Cobwebs draped the corners of the ceiling like funeral shrouds. The place didn't feel lived in. It felt haunted by an absence. It was the house of a man who had forgotten how to live, or had chosen not to. Looking at her sleeping children, their faces peaceful for the first time in months, a fierce resolve settled in Hattie. She could not simply take this man's charity and move on. There was nowhere to move on to. Her past was a grave, and her future was a blank, terrifying space. This house, this moment, was all she had. And she would hold on to it with everything she was. She would earn her place. Quietly, she slipped out from under the blanket. She found the kitchen, a room as cold and dusty as the first, but it had a good iron stove, a pump at the sink, and shelves sparsely stocked with flour, beans, and coffee. It was enough. She found an old apron hanging on a peg, stiff with disuse, and tied it around her waist. She was a widow, a refugee, a beggar. But she was also Will's wife, and Will had never eaten a cold meal in his life if she could help it. She knew how to make a home out of nothing. It was the one skill she had left. She started with the stove. She coaxed the embers back to life, adding kindling until a steady warmth began to push back the chill. She put a kettle on to boil. The simple domestic act felt like a prayer. Ben woke first, his eyes wide with uncertainty. "What are you doing, Ma?" "I'm earning our keep," she said, her voice firm. "Find a rag, son. We're going to let some light into this place." For the next 3 hours they worked. Hattie, with a strength born of desperation, attacked the years of neglect. She scrubbed the long wooden table in the kitchen until the pale grain of the wood showed through. She washed the windows, the cold water stinging her hands, but the reward was a flood of clean winter light that made the whole room feel different, newer. Ben and Sarah, catching her sense of purpose, dusted chairs and swept the floor, their small, concentrated efforts chasing the shadows from the corners. Hattie found a small sack of potatoes and some onions in the root cellar. She made a thick, savory stew, the smell filling the house, battling against the ghosts of dust and sorrow. She even found a small amount of flour and baked a batch of biscuits, setting them on the stovetop to cool. The house was transformed. It was still sparse, still the home of a solitary man, but it was clean. It was warm. It smelled of food and lye soap and human effort. It smelled like a home. Hattie had just finished wiping down the mantelpiece, her arm aching, when the front door opened. Thatcher stepped inside. He stopped dead just over the threshold, his big frame filling the doorway. The cold of the outdoors clung to him, a visible aura of frost on his coat and beard. His eyes, those winter sky eyes, moved slowly around the room. He took in the clean floors, the sparkling windows, the warm glow from the hearth. His gaze settled on the kitchen table where Hattie had set 3 bowls for the children, who were now sitting quietly, watching him with a mixture of fear and awe. He sniffed the air, and for the first time, his expression changed. A flicker of something, confusion, surprise, crossed his face. He looked at Hattie. She stood by the fire, her hands clasped in front of her, her face smudged with soot, the old apron tied around her thin frame. She didn't flinch under his gaze. She had done the work. She had made her stand not with words, but with action. He walked past her without a word and went into the kitchen. She heard the clink of a bowl, the scrape of a ladle. He returned to the main room, a steaming bowl of stew in his hand. He sat in his usual chair in the corner and began to eat. He ate the whole bowl, his eyes fixed on the fire. When he was done, he took one of the biscuits from the plate on the hearth. He bit into it. He chewed slowly, deliberately. Hattie held her breath. The entire world seemed to hang on this one man's reaction to a simple biscuit. Finally, he swallowed. He looked over at her, his gaze direct and unreadable. "The notice stands," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You can stay. On trial." It wasn't praise. It wasn't a welcome. But it was a foothold. Hattie let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. It was enough. Life with Thatcher settled into a quiet, careful rhythm. He was a man of immense and unbreachable silence. He would leave before dawn, a silent shape moving through the pre-dawn gloom, and return after dusk, bringing the cold of the evening in with him. He rarely spoke, and when he did, it was in short, practical sentences. Need more wood for the stove. There's a storm coming from the west. The pump handle is sticking. Hattie answered in kind. She did not ask him where he went or what he did. She knew his reputation in the town now. Thatcher. The name was spoken with a mixture of fear and respect. A gunslinger, they said. Had been a lawman somewhere south, until something happened. Now he just kept to himself, taking on odd jobs that no one else would. Tracking bounties, guarding payroll shipments. He was a man who dealt in violence, yet in his own home, he was a ghost, a presence felt more than seen. But Hattie saw the cracks in his armor. She saw them in the way his gaze would sometimes linger on her children as they played by the fire, a deep, hollow sadness in his eyes. She saw it in the untouched room at the top of the stairs, the door always closed, a fine layer of dust undisturbed along its bottom edge. She saw it in the profound weariness that settled on him when he thought no one was looking. He was a powerful man, but he was a broken one. He was a man drowning in a silence of his own making. Hattie did not try to fill that silence with chatter. She filled it with life. She cooked, she cleaned, she mended. She filled the house with the smell of baking bread and the sound of children's laughter. She was not trying to fix him. She was simply trying to survive, to build a small pocket of warmth and safety in a cold world. But in doing so, she was unknowingly mending the frayed edges of his life. One morning, a week into her stay, she was washing the children's clothes, her hands raw from the lye soap and icy water. Their shoes, worn through from the long journey, were lined up by the door, a pathetic sight. Ben's had a hole in the sole that he'd tried to stuff with newspaper. Hattie's heart ached looking at them. That afternoon, when she went to bring in firewood from the porch, she found them. 3 pairs of new boots. Sturdy, well-made leather boots, small enough for each of her children. They were just sitting there. There was no note, no explanation. When Thatcher came home that evening, the children ran to him, shouting their thanks, showing off their new footwear. He merely grunted, his face unreadable, and brushed past them to his chair by the fire. But Hattie saw the faint flush on his neck, the way he avoided her eyes. He had done this for them. A man who dealt in death had bought shoes for her children. The gesture was so quiet, so profound, it left her breathless. She said nothing, only placed his plate of supper on the small table beside him, her hand trembling slightly. It was a language they were beginning to build, one of gestures and unspoken understanding. Thatcher's property included a small corral behind the house. In it was a single horse, a magnificent gray gelding with a wild eye and a coat the color of morning mist. The horse, which Hattie heard him call Ghost, was skittish and mean. It would rear and kick if anyone came too close. Thatcher never rode it. He fed and watered it with a grim efficiency, but never touched it. Hattie, who had grown up on a small farm before Will, knew horses. She saw the fear in the animal, not meanness. It was a mirror of the man who owned it. Powerful, beautiful, and trapped in its own pain. So she began to spend time by the corral. She didn't try to approach the horse. She would just bring a stool and sit, mending clothes or peeling potatoes, talking to it in a low, calm voice. She told it about her journey, about Will, about the children. She poured out her heart to the one creature who couldn't judge her. At first, Ghost would pace the far side of the corral, snorting and tossing its head. But slowly, day by day, it began to quiet. It would stand and listen, its ears pricked toward her. Then one afternoon, it took a hesitant step toward her, then another, until it was standing just on the other side of the fence, its head lowered, its breath misting in the cold air. Hattie reached out a slow hand and laid it on the horse's velvety nose. The horse did not flinch. It leaned into her touch. A sound made her look up. Thatcher was standing by the corner of the barn, a stack of fence posts in his arms. He was staring, his mouth slightly agape. He had been watching her. She didn't know for how long. He looked from her hand on the horse to her face, and the confusion in his eyes was so plain, so vulnerable, it made her heart skip a beat. He seemed to shake himself, then turned and went back to his work without a word. But after that, things changed. He started finding reasons to work near the corral when she was there. He'd mend the fence, clean out the trough, his movements slow and deliberate. They would work for an hour or more in complete silence, the only sounds the creak of leather, the rhythmic thump of a hammer, and Hattie's low voice talking to the horse. The silence between them was no longer empty. It was full. It was a shared space, a comfortable quiet that neither of them seemed to want to break. He was beginning to need her presence, and that need, she could tell, terrified him. One evening, the sky turned a bruised, angry color. The wind picked up, rattling the windows in their frames. "Storm's here," Thatcher said, his voice tight as he bolted the front door. Hattie was already moving, checking the latches, making sure the children were settled and calm. A loose shutter on the side porch was banging against the house, a frantic, irregular rhythm. "I'll get it," she said, grabbing her shawl. "Leave it," he commanded. "It's not safe." But the sound grated on her nerves, another layer of chaos in a life that had had too much of it. "It'll take but a second," she insisted, and slipped out the side door before he could stop her. The wind hit her like a solid wall, tearing the shawl from her hands. Rain, hard and cold as pellets of ice, lashed her face. She fought her way to the shutter, her skirts whipping around her legs. She was struggling to latch it, her fingers numb and clumsy, when a furious gust of wind caught it and slammed it shut, catching her off balance. She cried out as she felt herself tipping backward off the edge of the porch. Suddenly, strong hands gripped her waist, hauling her back against a solid wall of a chest. It was Thatcher. He had come out after her. His arms were wrapped around her, holding her steady against the fury of the storm. For a moment they just stood there, locked together, the wind and rain swirling around them. Hattie could feel the frantic beat of his heart against her back, or maybe it was her own. His breath was warm on her cheek. He turned her slowly to face him. In the flickering light from the kitchen window, his face was a mask of shadows and stark angles. His eyes were dark, intense, searching hers. The hard wall of his composure had crumbled, and in its place was something raw and unguarded. He looked at her as if he were seeing her for the first time. He leaned in, and she thought, she hoped, he was going to kiss her. The air crackled with a tension that had nothing to do with the storm. Then, as quickly as it appeared, the moment was gone. He seemed to catch himself. The vulnerability vanished from his eyes, replaced by the familiar shuttered look. He released her abruptly, his hands dropping from her waist as if she had burned him. "Get inside," he growled, his voice harsher than she had ever heard it. He turned and strode back into the house, leaving her alone on the porch, trembling from more than just the cold. The gap between them had almost closed, and the force with which he had pried it open again left an ache in her chest that was sharper than any winter wind. The town of Redemption did not live up to its name. It was a place of judgment, and its chief magistrate was Mrs. Gable, the woman who ran the general store with an iron fist and a perpetually pursed lip. She was the hub of all gossip, the arbiter of social standing. From the moment Hattie had first walked into her store, 3 small, quiet children in tow, to buy flour with the money Thatcher had silently left on the kitchen table, Mrs. Gable had marked her as an unwelcome anomaly. a widow with children living under the roof of the town's most dangerous and eligible bachelor, was a scandal she could not abide. It was made worse by the fact that Mrs. Gable had a niece, a doughy, plain girl named Elspeth, whom she had been grooming for the housekeeper position and, eventually, for the role of Mrs. Thatcher. Hattie's arrival had upset a carefully laid plan. The whispers started small, a cold shoulder when Hattie came to buy thread, a conversation that stopped abruptly when she entered the store. Then the whispers grew teeth. She was a grifter, they said, who had trapped the poor, grieving Mr. Thatcher with her brood of children. She was a woman of loose morals, a saloon girl from some dusty town down south, hiding her past. The poison spread quickly through the small community. Mothers pulled their children away when Hattie and her little ones walked down the street. The few women who had offered a hesitant smile in the beginning now looked through her as if she were made of glass. Hattie tried to ignore it. She had faced far worse than gossip. She drew her world in, making the Thatcher house her entire universe. The clean floors, the warm stove, the quiet company of the gray horse, and the steady, silent presence of the man who owned it all. That was her reality. The town could think what it wanted, but the town's cruelty had a way of seeping under the door. One afternoon, Ben came home from the makeshift school held in the back of the church with a split lip and a bruised eye. He wouldn't say what happened, his face a mask of shame and fury. But later that night, Hattie heard him whispering to Sarah. "They said Ma is a bad woman. They said Mr. Thatcher is her beau and it ain't right." The words were a physical blow. Hattie felt the air leave her lungs, her children. She could endure the town's scorn, but she could not, would not, allow it to touch her children. The poison was not just for her. It was for them, too. It was staining their innocence, forcing them to carry a shame that was not theirs. The following week, the threat escalated from whispers to open warfare. Hattie needed to buy medicine for Leo, whose cough had returned with the damp weather. She bundled him up and walked into Gable's general store, her head held high. The store was crowded, it being the day the stagecoach brought mail and supplies. As Hattie approached the counter, Mrs. Gable looked up, her face a thundercloud. "Well, look what the wind blew in," she said, her voice loud enough for everyone in the store to hear. A hush fell over the room. "Come for more charity, have you? Or has Mr. Thatcher finally tired of you and yours?" Hattie's face burned, but she kept her voice steady. "I need the cough syrup for my son, Mrs. Gable. I have money to pay." She placed the coins Thatcher had given her on the counter. Mrs. Gable sneered, ignoring the money. "Your son? Are you sure he's your late husband's? A woman who moves into a bachelor's house so quickly, one has to wonder." A collective gasp went through the store. The accusation was so vile, so nakedly cruel, that it hung in the air like smoke. Hattie stood frozen, her hand hovering over the coins. She looked at the faces around her. Some looked away in shame. Others watched with a grim, morbid curiosity. No one spoke up for her. In their eyes, she was already condemned. She was an outsider, a disruption, and they were closing ranks against her. She looked at Leo, his small face flushed with fever, his eyes wide and confused. This was what her presence here was costing them. She was a blight on Thatcher's name and a target for her children. The small, fragile home she had built was a prison, and the town was the warden. In that moment, staring into the hateful eyes of Mrs. Gable, Hattie knew she could not stay. To protect Thatcher from the scandal and her children from the poison, she had to leave. She had to disappear. She grabbed the coins from the counter, her pride a small, hard thing in her throat. Without a word, she turned and walked out of the store, the silence of the crowd following her like a physical weight. The door closed behind her and she leaned against the cold wood, the world tilting around her. The safety she had found was an illusion. There was no redemption in this town, only judgment. That night, the house was quieter than ever. Thatcher had taken a 2-day job, guarding a payroll wagon to the next county. He wasn't due back until the following evening. The silence, usually a comfort, now felt oppressive, filled with the echoes of Mrs. Gable's cruel words. Hattie put the children to bed, their small, sleeping faces a fresh torment. She had brought them to this place for safety, and instead, she had put them in the line of fire. Her decision was made. It was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but it was clear. She could not fight a whole town. She could not ask Thatcher to. He had offered her shelter, not a war. To stay would be to drag him down, to repay his quiet decency with public disgrace. After the children were asleep, she began to pack. There wasn't much. The few worn clothes they'd arrived with, the mended blankets, a small doll she had fashioned for Sarah out of scraps. She looked at the new boots lined up by the door. Leaving them felt like a betrayal, but taking them felt like theft. She decided to leave them. They were a gift from a man to children he had sheltered, not a payment to a woman he had hired. The house was warm and clean around her, a testament to her work. Every polished surface, every mended seam, was a small piece of her heart she was leaving behind. She went into the kitchen and sat at the table she had scrubbed back to life. By the light of a single candle, she wrote a note. Her hand shook, and the words were clumsy, inadequate. Mr. Thatcher, thank you for your kindness to me and my children. You gave us shelter when we had none. I can never repay you. I am leaving because my being here has brought you trouble. I will not be the cause of your good name being spoiled in this town. Please do not look for us. We will be fine. She hesitated, then added one more line, the ink blurring as a tear fell onto the page. I am sorry. She signed it simply, Hattie. She folded the paper and left it in the center of the table, a stark white square in the middle of the dark polished wood. She took one last look around the room, memorizing the way the candlelight flickered on the clean pine floors. She thought of the silent man who lived here, the deep sadness in his eyes. For a brief, foolish time, she had allowed herself to imagine that she could bring life back into those eyes, that she could fill the echoing silence of his home. She had been wrong. She wrapped the sleeping Leo in a blanket and woke Ben and Sarah, her finger to her lips. We have to go, she whispered, her voice thick with unshed tears. Be very quiet. They slipped out of the house like ghosts, closing the door softly behind them. The cold of the night was a brutal shock after the warmth of the house. A light snow had begun to fall, dusting the world in a layer of white, erasing their footprints almost as soon as they were made. Hattie did not look back. She set her face toward the dark road heading east, away from Redemption, and walked into the freezing darkness, leaving behind the only home she had found since Will had died. The fragile connection she had built with the silent gunslinger felt severed, the loss a gaping wound in her chest. It was over. Thatcher rode hard through the falling snow, a day earlier than expected. The payroll job had finished without incident, and an unfamiliar urgency pulled him homeward. He'd spent 2 days in the company of loud, boisterous guards, and their easy chatter had only served to highlight the profound, comfortable silence he had come to share with Hattie. He found himself thinking of the smell of baking bread that now clung to his house, of the sight of her sitting by the fire, her head bent over some mending. He thought of the way her presence had pushed back the ghosts that had haunted his rooms for 3 long years. A man can stand the quiet. It's the silence that kills him. He hadn't realized how silent his life had been until she had filled it with the soft sounds of living. He swung down from his horse in the yard, his boots sinking into the fresh snow. The house was dark. Not just dark, but inert. The warm yellow glow that usually spilled from the kitchen window was gone. A knot of unease tightened in his gut. He pushed the door open. The cold from inside met him like a slap. It was the dead, empty cold of a place unoccupied. The cold he had lived with for years and had only just stopped noticing. "Hattie?" he called out. His voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence. There was no answer. No scurry of children's feet. No soft reply from the kitchen. The house was a tomb again. He strode into the main room. The fire was dead. A pile of gray ash on the hearth. A terrible, familiar emptiness washed over him. He had not felt this hollow since the day he buried his wife and child. Then he saw it. The white square of paper on the kitchen table. He walked toward it slowly, a sense of dread coiling in his stomach. He picked up the note. His hands, usually so steady, trembled slightly as he read her words. "My being here has brought you trouble. I will not be the cause of your good name being spoiled." The note fell from his fingers. Trouble. Spoil his name. What did he care for the bleating of the town sheep? He had built his life on not caring what anyone thought. But she had cared. She had left to protect him. And in doing so, she had taken the one thing that had begun to mend the broken pieces of his soul. The loss was not an idea. It was a physical pain. A gaping hole where warmth and life had been. He looked around the clean, empty room. She had made this a home again, and he had been too blind, too locked inside his own grief, to tell her what that meant. He had let her believe she was just a housekeeper. He saw the 3 pairs of new boots, left neatly by the door. The sight broke something in him. He sank into a chair, his head in his hands, the silence of the house pressing in on him. He had saved her from the cold once, out of a grudging sense of duty. Now, the thought of her and her children out in this storm, alone and unprotected, was a torment he could not bear. But it was more than that. It wasn't just her he needed to save, it was himself. Without her, he would slide back into the gray emptiness, and this time, he knew he would not survive it. He could not lose her. A sudden cold fury rose in him. This was the town's doing. This was the work of their petty cruelties and their sharp-edged gossip. This was Mrs. Gable. He stood up, his decision made. He was not a man for words, but some things had to be said, and some people had to be silenced. He didn't bother with a coat. He strode out of his house into the swirling snow and marched directly toward the center of town. He didn't go to the saloon or the sheriff's office. He went straight to Gable's general store. The lights were on in the apartment above. He pounded on the door, the sound echoing down the empty, snow-covered street. After a moment, a light appeared and the door opened a crack. Mr. Gable, a small, balding man, peered out. "Thatcher? What in God's name?" Thatcher pushed the door open and stepped inside, bringing the snow and the fury of the night with him. "Where is your wife?" he demanded, his voice a low, dangerous growl. Mrs. Gable appeared at the top of the stairs, a wrapper clutched to her chest. "What is the meaning of this?" she began, her voice shrill. Thatcher cut her off. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The quiet menace in his tone was more terrifying than any shout. "Hattie is gone," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "She left. Because of you. Because of the poison you speak." He took a step closer. "She is more of a lady in her worn-out dress than you will ever be in your Sunday finest. She is a better woman, a better mother, and a better human being than anyone in this miserable town." He was standing at the bottom of the stairs now, looking up at her. "So hear me now, Mrs. Gable. You will stop. If I ever hear another word spoken against her or her children, from you or from anyone else who listens to you, I will personally see to it that this store has no customers. I will see to it that your supply wagons find the roads impassable. I will make your life here so difficult you'll wish you had packed up and moved to the territories. Hattie is my concern, and anyone who harms her will have to answer to me." He turned without waiting for a reply, leaving the Gables standing there, stunned into silence. He had done it. He had stood against the town for her. He had made his choice public. Now, he had to find her. Meanwhile, the storm had turned into a blizzard. The road had disappeared under a blanket of white. Hattie trudged onward, Leo a heavy, feverish weight in her arms. Ben and Sarah stumbled behind her, their hands linked, their faces numb with cold. They were half frozen again, the events of their arrival replaying as a cruel nightmare. The wind was a physical force, pushing them back, stealing their breath. "Ma, I can't," Sarah cried, her voice thin and lost in the gale. "I'm too cold." Hattie knew they couldn't go on. Off the road, she spotted the dark, skeletal shape of an old line shack, a tiny shelter for ranchers caught out on the range. It was dilapidated with gaps in the walls, but it was better than nothing. "In here," she gasped, pushing open the rickety door. Inside, it was dark and smelled of old hay and mouse droppings, but it broke the wind. Hattie gently laid Leo down on a pile of dry hay in the corner. His skin was hot to the touch, his breathing shallow. She had to get him warm. This was not a time for despair. This was a time for action. Her hard life had taught her things beyond cooking and cleaning. It had taught her how to survive. "Ben," she said, her voice sharp with purpose, "pry those loose boards from the wall. We need a fire. Sarah, find any dry grass, any old paper, anything that will burn." She worked with a frantic energy, stuffing the gaps in the walls with handfuls of hay to block the wind. She found a rusty bucket and filled it with snow, setting it near where she planned the fire. She would not be a victim. She would not wait to be rescued. She would save her family. Thatcher saddled Ghost. The gray horse which had once fought his touch now stood steady, as if it understood the urgency of the mission. It was Hattie's calm hand that had made this possible. He rode out, not guessing, but knowing. She would take the east road. It was the only way that led anywhere. The snow was deep, but he saw the faint, almost erased tracks of a woman and 2 small children. He urged Ghost on, his heart a cold lump of fear in his chest. He found them in the line shack. He saw the flicker of light from the doorway. He swung down from his horse and pushed the door open. The scene inside stopped him cold. Hattie was kneeling by a small, expertly built fire in the center of the dirt floor, her face illuminated by the flames. She was bathing Leo's face with a strip of her own petticoat dipped in melted snow. Ben and Sarah were huddled together, asleep under a blanket. She had not been waiting for help. She had been fighting. She had been saving them. She looked up as he entered, her eyes wide with shock. She looked tired, worn, but she was not defeated. She was magnificent. He walked over and knelt beside her. He didn't say, "I came to rescue you." He didn't say, "I was worried." He looked at her, then at the feverish child, then back at her face, smudged with soot and etched with worry. He reached out and brushed a stray piece of hay from her hair. His touch was gentle. "Your home is back there," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could no longer hide. "With me." Tears welled in Hattie's eyes, spilling down her cheeks. He had come for her. He had stood for her. She knew it without him having to say the words. He had rescued her from the storm, but her leaving had rescued him from his prison of silence. He lifted the sleeping Leo into his arms. "Let's go home," he said. And this time, the word felt real. The town of Redemption was different after that night. Thatcher's confrontation with Mrs. Gable had spread like wildfire. No one dared to cross him, and by extension, no one dared to cross Hattie. The whispers stopped. The cold shoulders warmed into hesitant nods. When Hattie walked into the general store a week later, Mrs. Gable served her with a clipped, grudging civility. The battle had been won not with violence, but with a quiet man's unwavering declaration. Life in the Thatcher house settled into a new rhythm, one of warmth and permanence. The door to the upstairs room remained closed, but the ghosts that had haunted the rest of the house seemed to have fled. The children's laughter was a constant, bright sound that filled the once empty spaces. Thatcher was still a man of few words, but his silences were different now. They were comfortable, shared. He would sit by the fire in the evenings, not cleaning his guns, but watching Ben practice his letters, or listening to Sarah sing a song to her rag doll. He began to talk to her, in his own way. He told her about Ghost, how the horse had belonged to his wife, Annabelle. He told her how they had lost her, and their infant daughter, to a fever 3 years ago. He spoke of it in short, clipped sentences, the pain still raw. But he spoke of it. He had opened the door to his grief, just a crack, and let Hattie in. And she, in turn, did not offer platitudes. She simply listened, her presence a quiet testament to shared sorrow and the possibility of survival. She was healing him, just as he had healed her own desperate situation. One evening in early spring, the last of the snow had melted, leaving the world smelling of damp earth and new beginnings. Hattie was on the porch, watching the sun set, a spectacular blaze of gold and rose. The children were chasing fireflies in the yard, their laughter like little bells. She felt a sense of peace so profound it was almost painful. Thatcher came out and stood beside her, leaning against the porch rail. They stood in comfortable silence for a long time, watching the colors fade from the sky. The world was vast and wild, but here, on this porch, she felt safe. She felt home. "Hattie," he said, his voice low. She turned to look at him. His face was serious in the twilight, his winter sky eyes fixed on her. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. It was not a ring. It was not a flower. It was a legal document, a deed. "I saw the lawyer in town today," he said, holding it out to her. "The house, and 10 acres. It's in your name now." Hattie stared at the paper, then at him, her heart hammering in her chest. "What? Why?" "A woman with children needs a place of her own," he said, his voice rough. "A place no one can make her leave. This is your home, Hattie. It's yours, whether I'm in it or not." It was the ultimate gesture from a man who valued independence above all else. He was giving her freedom. He was giving her power. He was telling her, in the only way he knew how, that he would never let her be helpless again. Tears filled her eyes, but this time they were not tears of sorrow or fear. They were tears of overwhelming gratitude. She looked at this hard, silent, broken man who had defended her, who had come for her in the storm, who had just given her the world. She did not take the paper. Instead, she reached out and took his large, calloused hand in both of hers. His skin was rough, but his grip was gentle as he laced his fingers with hers. She looked up into his eyes. "It's only home if you're in it, Thatcher," she said softly. A slow smile spread across his face, a rare, beautiful thing that transformed his hard features. It reached his eyes, and for the first time, the winter sky in them warmed into the color of a clear spring morning. He squeezed her hand, a quiet, irreversible promise passing between them. The sun had set, and the stars were beginning to appear in the vast prairie sky, but on the porch of the house that was finally a home, they had all the light they needed.